You know, the first time I met Michael Hanzman, we were at a dinner with Judge Scola and Bob Burlington and our wives, fancy kind of steakhouse. And Scola does this thing that he does where he just launches into this very long story. And so we're sitting there, I'm paying close attention because I'm the young guy at the table. And suddenly I get like a tap on my shoulder. So I don't really want to look because I don't want to offend Judge Scola. And but I look at the corner of my eye, and obviously this like bald, gleaming head is staring at me, you know? So taps me again. So now I turn more fully, and his face is like right next to my face. So now I'm like in this weird spot, like, do I offend Judge Scola? Do I offend this guy I just met, you know? And so I finally went with it. I said, you know, Judge Scola is like my Italian grandfather, so he's not going to be upset if I just pay attention to this new guy. So I look over at Hanzman, and he goes, "You're not listening to anything, are you?" And that's when I knew that Hanzman and I were going to be close friends. Last week, at our Pesach Seder, we sang the ancient Jewish hymn, Avadim Hayinu. We were slaves in Egypt. And after the song at our Seder, my boys ran up to me, and my eldest son, Gideon, said, "Papa, my teacher says that we're not slaves anymore, that we now are a free people in our own land." And I had to bite my tongue because I knew what he did not know, which is that this year we are not all free. That this year 133 Jewish men and women, Jewish boys and girls, are being held in holes, even as we sit here tonight, in deep, dark, dank holes, hundreds of feet beneath the earth, without food, without water, without medicine, without even sunlight, being surveilled by real-life monsters. And 6 of them are American citizens, and we don't even know their names. We never say their names. We never hear their names on the pages of our newspapers or on our news channels. Last month, Judge Scola and I and 14 federal judges from around the country went to Israel on a first-of-its-kind judicial mission to that country. And we watched the 47-minute video of Hamas atrocities, filmed by Hamas phones and Hamas GoPro cameras, an evil that you in your darkest nightmare could never begin to conjure. And all 14 of us sat in that room for 47 infinite minutes, watching the mutilation, the barbarism, the sexual violence, right there on screen like it was a movie. But maybe what was most disconcerting about the video was the background noise, the screams, the constant refrain, not of Free Palestine, that never showed up, of Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, and then giggling and laughing and high-fiving and jubilation. On October 7th, 4,000 terrorists invaded a sovereign land and butchered and slaughtered 1,200 innocent civilians in the greatest massacre of innocent Jews since the Holocaust. And yet somehow, on the campuses of my alma maters, at universities all over this country, we Jews are the aggressors. They raped hundreds of women. And yet somehow, in Western media outlets, we Jews are the oppressors. They took more than 240 Jewish men and women, boys and girls, hostage, septuagenarians, octogenarians, and 12 infants and toddlers, one of whom you saw his picture just turned 1 year old in captivity. And they held them for 30, 50, 100, now 220 days, and yet at the United Nations, we Jews are the violators of human rights. How can this be? The moral inversion, the moral confusion, the moral vulnerability that we're seeing all around us is almost too pathetic for words. Where does it come from? Well, Judge Scola and I were also taken, the first thing we did, to Yad Vashem. We were given a tour by the head archivist, amazing man, and he took us to a room I had never been to before. It was early German propaganda, 1933, 1934. And the thing that stuck with me the most was a poster of a giant cockroach dressed as a Jew. In one eye is the reflection of money bags, Jewish capitalism, high finance. In the other eye, the hammer and sickle, Jewish communism and poverty. And right next to it, there's a TV screen. And it's Hitler. And he's giving a speech. And he says, we aim to eradicate Jewish wealth, high finance, and capitalism from the European continent. And we mean, in the next sentence, to eradicate Jewish poverty and communism and egalitarianism from the European continent. And the archivist looks at us, the judges, and says, most Westerners come and see this exhibit and say, aha, I understand now. The Nazis were idiots. Jews can't be bad because they're both rich and poor, because they're capitalists and communists at the same time. That doesn't make sense. But that, he taught us, is to misunderstand what Jew hatred really is. It is an ancient virus. It is the lie that a sick and dying body politic is willing to accept. Throughout our history, societies that persecute Jews are societies that are on their way out the window. Think of the Kishinev of Russia. In 1903, 14 years later, it is gone. Think of the Germany of Kristallnacht in 1938. 7 years later, it is gone. Time and again in history, we have seen that societies that allow the moral rot of Jew hatred to proliferate are societies that are allowing a deadly disease to take hold of their body politic. So not because we are Jews, but because we are Americans, and because we love this country, we have a moral obligation to identify and root out anti-Semitism whenever and wherever it may be found. It is the canary in our coal mine. So what are the lies that our society is willing to accept about Jews? Some of you have seen my speeches around the country. I talk about 6 big lies about Jews in the state of Israel. But Judge Scola has told me that if I go over 20 minutes, he will yank me off the stage himself. And so I have cut it to 3. The man has 2 titanium hips, and I am concerned for my safety. The first big lie is that Jews are colonists in the land of Israel. This is the lie that has swept academia since the 1940s, that we came from Poland and Belarus and, I guess, Brooklyn in 1948. Folks, the first extra-biblical mention of the Jews in the land of Israel comes from the year 1205 BC. Ramses II's son Merneptah became pharaoh of all Egypt. And he composed a giant stele, a giant basalt tablet. It's 12 feet high and 10 inches thick. And on the tablet, Merneptah's scribes discussed all of his military victories. And at the very bottom, Merneptah's scribes say that Merneptah brought his Egyptian army into, not Palestine, Israel. And he fought the kingdom of Israel at places like Ashkelon and Gezer, two places that are still in the land of Israel today. And he said he defeated the king of Israel in battle. And he says, and I wiped his seed from the earth. Well, obviously, I'm still here, so he was lying about that. But he's allowed a little bit of poetic license. And Jews lived and ruled in the land of Israel continuously for 2,000 years. In the year 132 AD, hundreds of years later, the Jews formed a kingdom in the land of Israel and issued their own currency. And Judge Skoll and I went to the Israel Museum and we saw those coins. There are thousands of them and they are amazing. On the front part of the coin is the facade of the Second Temple. The same Second Temple the Jews had built when Cyrus II of Persia had sent them back from exile into the land of Israel in 538 BC. Just as context, folks, Muhammad isn't born till the year 570 AD. Islam isn't a thing in the Middle East until the 620s AD. This is thousands of years before Islam was even a thing in the Middle East. The same Second Temple whose outer retaining wall, the Western Wall, we Jews still worship at today in the land of Israel. And above the facade of the Second Temple, in 132 AD, 2,000 years ago, is the Jewish Star of David, which still adorns the center of the flag of the Jewish state of Israel, an unbelievable connection to our past. But that's not all. On the obverse side of the coin, around a lulav. The lulav is the plant that we Jews shake on the holiday of Sukkot to commemorate our exodus from Egypt 3,000 years ago. Around the lulav, in Hebrew letters, not Polish, not Belarusian or English from Brooklyn, in Hebrew letters is written the words, year one in the redemption of Israel. Year one in the redemption of Israel. And that's why in 1948, 2,000 years later, when it came time to decide what will we call this redeemed and reconstituted Jewish state in the land of Israel, the committee headed by David Ben-Gurion voted over other options. Let's call it Israel, because that was year one in the redemption of a land and a people and a kingdom that had ruled and governed in the land for thousands of years. If you go back 3,000 years ago and you fast forward to today and you analyze all the different peoples who existed at that time, there is only one people who still speak the same language, still practice the same religion, still live and govern in the same land as they did 3,000 years ago, and those are the Jews who live and rule in Israel. Folks, if we care about the rights of indigenous people, there is no more indigenous people in the world than the Jews who govern the modern state of Israel, and you don't have to take my word for it. Because in 1918, on March the 23rd of 1918, King Hussein, remember at that time there were no things like Syria and Iraq and Jordan. Those were all created later. There was only the king of all the Arabs, and his name was King Hussein. If you've ever seen Lawrence of Arabia, it's his son Faisal who fights with Peter O'Toole, Lawrence, to slough off Ottoman rule once and for all in the Middle East. That's King Hussein, king of all the Arabs, maybe the greatest hero in Arab history. And he writes an op-ed, not in the Wall Street Journal, in the Al-Qibla Daily News, the Mecca Daily News. And he says, if we want the British to recognize our claim to our ancestral lands in Saudi Arabia, in Syria, in Jordan, then we cannot deny the Jewish claim to their ancestral homeland. And then he says at the end of the article, and I quote, they, the Jews, are the original sons of that land, the land of Israel. 9 months later, in December, his son, Prince Faisal, who fought with T.E. Lawrence against the Ottomans at the end of World War I, has a banquet in his honor. And he turns to Lord Rothschild, a Jewish man, and says to my Zionist friends, I recognize your ancestral claim to the land. Welcome home. But somehow, on college campuses across America, we Jews are white settler colonists in the land of Israel. Nothing could be further from the truth. The second big lie about the state of Israel is that what happened in 1948 was somehow illegitimate. Folks, again, a total lie. In 1947, the United Nations voted 33-13 to recognize the ancestral home of the Jewish people and to ratify their ancient claim to the land. And there are really three ways in which a nation can become a state. You can win it in a war, and there are two kinds of wars: offensive wars and wars of survival. You can have a long presence in the land, well established, and you can have a legal deed that says, I have a right to this land, much as you would in your home. Let's compare it to a country we all agree is legitimate, the United States. We won it in a war, 1776 to 1783, but it was an offensive war. George III didn't want that war. Is it legitimate? It's unquestionably legitimate. Second, are we indigenous to the land? Of course not. We came in 1607 to Jamestown as Englishmen. It wasn't until 1761 that John Adams said the child revolution was born in a courthouse in Boston, Massachusetts. So are we indigenous to the land? Of course not. Are we legitimate? Of course we are. Third claim, third prong. Do we have a deed? Do we have a document? Well, we have one of the greatest documents of all time, the Declaration of Independence. But it was written by Thomas Jefferson, and it was edited by the 5 members on the Committee on Style: Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Ben Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston, all patriots, all Americans. But no one would suggest that if 4,000 Mexican nationals crossed the border and slaughtered 35,000 people in La Jolla, which is what it would be per capita, and took several thousand hostage back into Tijuana, that somehow that would be okay because they were just reclaiming their ancestral land. No one would say that. And yet we say that when it comes to the Jews who live in Israel. Let's compare the 3 prongs to the Jewish state of Israel. They've won the land in war after war after war. Not wars of offense, wars of survival. 48, invaded by 5 Arab armies. 56 in the Suez against Egypt. 67 against 6 Arab armies. 73 on the holiest day of the year, Yom Kippur, surprised at synagogues and in their homes by the Syrian and Egyptian air forces, and still they won the land, unquestionably legitimate under the law. Second, we've already established the Jews haven't been there for 50 years or 100 years or 200 years. They're the indigenous people of the land. They've been there for thousands of years. Third prong, the Jews just don't have a Declaration of Independence. They do have that. But they have a legal deed, a vote 2 times by the combined representatives of the nations of the world in General Assembly. One in 1947, 33-13. And then we judges, we don't like motions for reconsideration. But the United States and the Soviet Union said, let's make the Jews prove it a second time after the 48 war. the Israelis said, we don't want to go back to the United Nations. And the U.S. said, go back and get it ratified. And this time they won by an even bigger margin, 37-12 in 1949. Is it legitimate? It's unquestionably legitimate. And yet, we Jews are called illegal occupiers and settlers in our own land. The third big lie about Israel is the same lie that has been told about Jews for thousands of years. In the Middle Ages, they said that Jews killed the babies of non-Jewish families for the matzah that they ate on Pesach, the ancient blood libel. And that blood libel has shape-shifted and transmogrified. During the plague, it was said that Jews carried the plague but couldn't be infected, and that they were purposefully infecting their neighbors, and that they were doing it on stolen land. Folks, the Jews are being accused of genocide in the ICJ, on Western campuses, and at the United Nations. But here are the facts. The fact of the matter is that if you look at the history of urban warfare, not just World War II, where America killed 3.5 million Japanese citizens after having lost 2,100 people at Pearl Harbor, not just when they killed, with our allies, almost 4 million German civilians in order to eradicate the evil of Nazism, but all the way up into the 21st century. The acceptable limit of militant to civilian casualties under international law is 1 to 9. The United States and our allies set the gold standard in Iraq and Afghanistan. We had a militant to civilian kill ratio of 1 to 4.5, 1 to 5. And many armies believe that in the context of urban warfare, no army would ever be able to meet that standard. Folks, in much more difficult scenarios where Hamas has purposefully built underground terror tunnels inside of civilian infrastructure, in mosques and hospitals and schools, Judge Scola and I saw in Boy Scout rooms, rocket launchers, in little girls' bedrooms, machine guns, in mosques and hospitals, an arsenal you wouldn't believe, imported from other countries. In that context, even if you believe Hamas's numbers from the Gaza Health Ministry, and by the way, we've never met the minister, even if you believe Hamas's numbers, Israel has done something no army has ever done before, a kill ratio of about 1 to 1 or 1.5. A gold standard that Major John Spencer of the U.S. Army and Colonel Richard Kemp of the British Army have said no army will ever be able to meet in the world. And yet it is Israel that is brought to the ICJ on false and laughable claims of genocide. So I've talked to you tonight about 3 big lies that are sad and ugly and are cause for pessimism. And the moral inversion on college campuses and in so much of the media make us all lose heart. But there are several things that give me hope and optimism, and I want to end with those tonight. The first thing is the Jewish people themselves in the land of Israel. Judge Scola and I, we went to Re'im, the scene of the music festival massacre, the Nova Festival. And when we came out, the memorial is overwhelming. 364 young Jewish boys and Jewish girls were killed at a dance party for peace there. Dozens were raped, and about 40 or 50 were taken hostage. And what they've done is they've built little mounds for each person who fell. And out of the mound is a stick with a picture of the person who was killed. When we came off the bus, we were consumed with the inconsolable, overwhelming sobs of a mother who had lost her son. She was lying prostrate over the mound of her son. It was so much you couldn't think or breathe. And I turned around and all the judges were behind me. And I thought, we got to get out of here. And so at that moment, I started to hear music. And I thought I was going crazy. So I started walking over towards the right. And sure enough, I came to a clearing where there were about 100 women, arm in arm in a giant circle. And they were singing Hatikva. And they turned to me and they said, "Please join us." And I did. And then I noticed that all these other judges from all over the country, Jews and non-Jews, people who'd been to Israel before, people who had never been to Israel before, were interlocked arm in arm with these 100 women, all singing the national anthem if they knew it, many crying. And I thought, what an incredible symbol of these people. In the spot where more Jews had been murdered than in any other place on earth since 1945, these women decided on a Thursday to leave whatever they were doing in their lives that day to drive all the way to the south near Gaza on a bus to get together and sing a song not of hatred or vengeance or vindictiveness, but of hope. Hatikva means hope. And of their love of country, love of each other, love of the land, for which they and their ancestors had fought for 2,000 years. A people that are deserving of our respect, our admiration, and our support. The last thing that gives me strength is Jewish people around the world. What we have seen in the last 6 months, Stuart mentioned it, I've been all over the country. I was in Kentucky yesterday and Ohio the day before, giving speeches about Israel. And everywhere I go, people line up after the speech and they tell me their stories. And they say, "Judge, I support Israel because a Jewish doctor once saved my mother." Or a Jewish landlord once knew that I couldn't pay the rent and gave me 6 months for free. Or a Jewish lawyer once took my case pro bono, and on and on and on. I've heard hundreds of stories like that in the last 6 months. And I say to you, be a light in the community. Carry the torch and the flame that has been passed down to you for thousands of years. You do not have the right to relinquish it. Our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, ledor, from generation to generation, have given us the light of tikkun olam, the light of leaving the world a better place than we found it, and they are watching us. The way you carry yourself in your home with your children and grandchildren, the way you carry yourself at work with your colleagues and opposing counsel, people are always watching. And that brings me back to Judge Hanzman. He has lived his life like that from the beginning. He's a model citizen, a great father and husband and friend, a wonderful lawyer and mediator and judge. And when our city faced one of the darkest moments in its history, the tragic loss of hundreds of innocent lives, his was the light that filled all the dark spaces with the radiance of tikkun olam. The Jewish admonition that we leave the world, as Judge Hanzman has, better, safer, and stronger than we found it. And so I say to you, Michael, that I am deeply honored to share the stage with you on a day like this. And I'm deeply grateful to you for all the light you continue to shine on this great country and the Jewish community that has banded together since October 7th. I love you, and Mazel Tov.